Hello everybody, my name's Peter Mauch. I teach Asian history at Western Sydney University in Australia. I've recently published a biography of General Tojo Hideki. The book was published in March 2026. It's some 500 pages in length, and as you'd expect from a biography, it follows Tojo from his birth in 1884 until his death in 1948. It also considers Tojo's ongoing role in what we might call Japanese war memory. Now, it's not possible, I think, to offer an overview of all of this without floundering in hopelessly broad generalizations. And so I've decided for today's purposes to focus on Tojo's role in a particular historical moment, namely the weeks between his appointment as Prime Minister and the opening shots of war in the Pacific. So just to put some specific dates on that, Tojo was appointed Prime Minister on 18th of October 1941. The opening shots of war in the Pacific, I think the audience will probably know this, but at least according to Japan time, December 8, 1941. So we're looking at a period of roughly 6 weeks, give or take. And I thought I would begin by sharing an image. Taken late on the afternoon of October 17, this photo captures Tojo on his way to an audience with the Emperor in the Imperial Palace. Tojo walked into this audience half expecting a severe scolding, for he had played a key role in the resignation one day earlier of the cabinet of Prime Minister Konoye Fumimaro. This perhaps requires a brief explanation. Tojo had been serving as Army Minister on Konoye's cabinet since July 1940. He had, in early September 1941, joined with his cabinet colleagues, as well as the Army and Navy Chiefs of Staff, to impose a deadline on diplomatic negotiations with the United States, so that in the absence of diplomatic success, Japan would go to war in the Pacific by the last 10 days of October. An imperial conference met, and as the name suggests, it did so in the presence of the emperor, on September 6th, and it had formalized that decision. By October, Prime Minister Konoye belatedly began worrying about Japan's prospects of victory in war in the Pacific, and he sought desperately to erase that deadline. He ran headlong into Tojo, who argued 2 points. First, decisions reached at an imperial conference, according to Tojo, were practically sacrosanct, and they could not be overturned on a whim. Tojo's second argument was that Imperial General Headquarters, in other words, the Army and Navy General Staffs, were, by constitutional provision, independent of the government, and they were under no compunction to accept a prime ministerial decision, particularly a prime ministerial decision that subverted due policymaking process. So these 2 points interlocked and intertwined with each other in ways, and frankly, I would argue that Tojo's logic was airtight, and it left Konoye nowhere to run. And so Konoye resigned his prime ministerial post and at least stalled Japan's march to war by means of that resignation on October 16. So now I'll direct your attentions to the next image on our screen. Now this was taken some 90 minutes after the previous image. Here, Tojo is leaving the Imperial Palace, and he looks, I think at least, even more tense than he did in the previous photograph. This was not because he had been scolded by his emperor. To the contrary, the emperor had ordered Tojo to form the next cabinet. In other words, the emperor had ordered him to serve as prime minister. Now, besides ordering Tojo to serve as prime minister, the emperor made 2 very specific requests of Tojo. First, he he asked Tojo to ensure that all his actions as Prime Minister remained within the provisions of the Constitution. He also asked Tojo to re-examine the situation, to discard the deadline for war, and to reset national policy. This latter request has become widely known as the Emperor's wipe the slate clean message, and this was a term which Tojo himself used. Now, so far as the wipe the slate clean message was concerned, there was no mistaking the Emperor's purport. He had repeatedly expressed a complete lack of confidence in Japan's prospects of victory in war in the Pacific. So he was quite clearly asking Tojo to steer Japan away from war. Yet, by insisting that Tojo remain within the provisions of the Constitution, he was insisting that Tojo not dictate an outcome other than war. He was insisting that Tojo essentially not do what Konoye had done in the dying days of his cabinet and simply subvert due policy-making process. Tojo, for his part, had spent the better part of his career grappling with those articles of the Constitution which, among other things, guaranteed the General Staff's independence of the cabinet. So I guess my point there is to suggest that Tojo understood very well the issues that he would face if he were to steer Japan away from war. So in essence, if he were going to meet the Emperor's wishes and to steer the nation away from war, he would somehow or other have to follow or have to convince Imperial General Headquarters, in other words, the General Staffs, to abandon advocacy of war in the Pacific. Now, that would be no easy process, and it's little wonder that Tojo looks particularly pensive in this photograph. Following his prime ministerial appointment, for roughly a week thereafter, Tojo led his cabinet and Imperial General Headquarters in a searching re-examination of the basis of Japanese policy, exactly as his emperor had asked. This earned him the ire of his professional military colleagues, particularly those on the Army General Staff. They insisted there was no room for reconsideration of existing policy, and they griped that the deadline for war had already passed. They also began wondering about Tojo himself. He had, they complained, toppled the Konoye cabinet on the grounds there was absolutely no prospect of success in the Japanese-US negotiations. Now, he seemed determined to pursue those very negotiations. They asked whether this was disadvantageous. Some asked whether it was even fraudulent. Some spoke darkly of Tojo's so-called palace cabinet. From that criticism stemmed a second related criticism. Tojo was, as Prime Minister, neglecting his roles and responsibilities as Army Minister. Tojo served in his cabinet not only as Prime Minister, but he remained on as Army Minister as well. And so, back to the criticism from within the army, one more time, they argued that Tojo was, as Prime Minister, neglecting his roles and responsibilities as Army Minister. They were convinced that Tojo, as Army Minister, ought to be convincing his cabinet colleagues of the strategic imperatives underpinning the Army General Staff's insistence on an immediate decision for war. Tojo, however, was going in precisely the opposite direction and insisting on a thoroughgoing re-examination of state policy. Some in the army advocated the Tojo cabinet's downfall. Remember, we are not even a week into his time as Prime Minister, and already from within the army he has professional military colleagues arguing for the downfall of his cabinet. Others, maybe we could say some more moderate voices from within the army, pushed instead for his forced resignation, at least from the army minister's post. So they were suggesting, okay, well, he can remain as Prime Minister, but let's put in another general as army minister to actually do the army minister's work as they saw it. Now, Tojo was, if nothing else, an extremely formidable individual, and he stared down opposition from within the army. Ultimately, however, the re-examination of state policy resulted in nothing more than what was effectively an extension to the deadline for war. Tojo's right-hand man and director of the Military Affairs Bureau, Lieutenant General Muto Akira, explained the situation to his army colleagues as follows, and I quote, "Japan is determined to go to war against the United States and Britain in order to complete the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Army and Navy are to prepare for that eventuality. That said, it will be fine if Japan achieves its objectives via ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Yet, if the negotiations do not turn out as they should by the beginning of December, we will commence operations." So, end quote. And in essence, what we have Muto here saying is that Japan's objectives, its aims, its goals are unmoving. The question is how Japan will achieve said aims. And as he made clear, that Japan would continue negotiating with the United States in the hope of convincing the United States to accept a series of terms and conditions. If the United States did not accept those terms and conditions, Japan would then go to war and seek to achieve those terms and conditions by means of war. I think it's useful at this point to pause and to suggest that Tojo knew full well that he had only partially met his emperor's wishes. He had, to be sure, remained strictly within a constitutional framework. He had certainly refrained from any dictatorial pronouncements, and he had led the government and armed services in a searching re-examination of state policy. In other words, he had followed precisely the process that the emperor had requested he follow. The result, however, was nothing more, again, than effectively an extended deadline for war. And this was not the outcome for which the emperor had hoped. And again, Tojo knew understood this very, very well. He reported the new deadline to his emperor through hot tears of anguish in early November 1941. Now, Japanese-US diplomacy over the ensuing weeks foundered, and I won't go into details there, but I think suffice it to note that these terms and conditions that the Tojo cabinet wanted the United States to accept were unlikely to convince the Roosevelt administration to accept said terms and conditions. Nonetheless, by late November, criticisms of Tojo from within the army had reached fever pitch. He was, army officers argued, weak-kneed. Others argued he had used the army as a springboard for his own ambitions and advancement. Some argued he ought to be overthrown or perhaps even obliterated. The idea of obliterating Tojo, that was a none too oblique reference to assassinating him. And these assassination plots seemed credible enough for Tojo to accept an around-the-clock military police escort. Ultimately, certainly within the Tojo cabinet, the pursuit of diplomatic negotiations reached an end point on November 26th. At that moment, Tokyo was in receipt of a memorandum from the United States government, and without going into any of the details, it made perfectly clear that the United States would not accept any of Japan's terms and conditions. Tojo at this moment was himself quite reflective, and I'll quote him directly. "The emperor said to return the Japanese-US negotiations to a clean slate and to re-examine state policy. I did just that, but we've reached the conclusion that no matter what, we must now go to war." End quote. Then, in an unguarded moment, he scoffed at the military officers who had criticized him since his prime ministerial appointment for his supposed cowardice. He had, to the very best of his ability, implemented and enacted the emperor's express wishes by remaining firmly within the confines of the constitution. The outcome was different to what the emperor wanted, but ultimately it was precisely what the army wanted. And Tojo, at least, reckoned that he had caused the emperor at least to accept war. Now, if we change tack slightly for a moment, I'll suggest that the emperor nonetheless continued to receive counsel suggesting that Japan would most likely lose if it went to war in the Pacific. On December 1st, two former prime ministers and retired admirals, namely Okada Keisuke and Yonai Mitsumasa, relayed precisely these concerns to the emperor. That same day, the emperor's youngest brother, Prince Takamatsu, himself an active service officer who at the time was serving on the Navy General Staff, told the emperor that the Navy could hope at very best for a stalemate, and on these grounds, the Navy actually wanted to avoid war altogether. This unsettled the emperor, and he summoned Tojo and asked whether it was possible, very, very bluntly, asked whether it was possible for Japan to win a war in the Pacific. Tojo, at this moment, his response, I think, is really, really interesting, and it reveals something about the Japanese decision-making process. He reminded the emperor that war in the Pacific was basically the Navy's responsibility. And I'll just summarize that point very, very briefly for everybody. In essence, the thinking here was that if war broke out in the Pacific, the Navy would bear the brunt of fighting. The Navy was therefore responsible for operational planning for war in the Pacific, and the Navy was, on those grounds, responsible for forecasting the prospects of victory of war in the Pacific. So, back to Tojo's point to the emperor, he put it much more succinct. Maybe he didn't need to go into quite that level of detail. He put it much more succinctly and reminded the emperor that war in the Pacific was basically the Navy's responsibility. And he invited the emperor to speak with Navy Chief of Staff Nagano Osami and Navy Minister Shimada Shigetaro. The emperor met with those two admirals, and they confidently predicted victory. The emperor felt not so much reassured as he felt boxed in. The naval leadership seemed not to be heeding dissonant voices from within the service, but the problem here was that only an autocrat could have discarded the advice of the two men ultimately responsible for advising him on Japan's chances of victory in the Pacific. And an autocrat the emperor was not. So with that audience went the emperor's last hope of a peaceful resolution of the issues dividing Japan and the United States. And at an imperial conference convened on December 1st, again, as the name Imperial Conference suggests, it convened in the presence of the emperor. A silent emperor looked on as Tojo explained, and I quote, "Our empire has no alternative but to begin war." End quote. Imperial General Headquarters convened the following day, on December 2nd, and set December 8, in Japan time at least, as the commencement date for hostilities. I'd like to change tack and consider Tojo's role in opening war without first declaring war. The emperor himself was among the first to insist that Tojo was responsible for this situation. Soon after the war had been fought and lost, the emperor stated that he had, and I quote, "no intention of having the war rescript used as General Tojo had used it." On another occasion, in the early aftermath of defeat, the emperor told General Douglas MacArthur that, and I quote, "the attack on Pearl Harbor prior to a declaration of war had been entirely contrary to his wishes and that he had been tricked by Tojo." Some historians have criticized the emperor for having made such claims. They point out that the emperor did not sign the imperial rescript declaring war until some 8 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, and they accuse him of engaging in a barefaced lie in an unseemly attempt at saving his own skin. Such criticisms can, I would suggest, be dismissed summarily. The emperor presumed in December 1941 that the Tojo cabinet would follow the precedent set during modern Japan's earlier wars, namely the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, and then World War I. In all these three cases, Japan's declaration of war involved a two-step process, including first, diplomatic notification of a state of hostilities, and then second, an imperial rescript, which formally declared a state of war. The emperor in December 1941 intervened directly in the drafting of the imperial rescript, but he did so in the belief that the timing of its public release was irrelevant because he presumed Japan would have already notified the United States and Britain of the commencement of hostilities via diplomatic note. Tojo was, however, marching to a different beat. A debate concerning the wisdom of alerting the enemy of Japan's intentions had begun in late November. This debate had arisen at least partly because of the almost prohibitively high risk inherent in the Pearl Harbor attack plan. And here I'll note that at least one historian has reasonably recently written that Combined Fleet Commander-in-Chief Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku proposed the plan in the counterintuitive hope that it would be rejected as too great a gamble. The naval leadership ultimately adopted the Pearl Harbor attack plan against its better judgment. Again, Japan's admirals regarded it as almost too risky. But again, they accepted the plan against their better judgment, and by late November, the naval leadership was worried enough to insist that diplomacy should be sacrificed. In other words, they wanted and felt they needed the element of surprise. In early December, the Foreign Ministry drafted a diplomatic note which would serve as notification of a state of hostilities. It clarified two things. First, Japan's intention to terminate negotiations, and second, it placed responsibility on the United States, and I quote, for any and all consequences that may arise in the future, end quote. That second point met international legal requirements and served as a declaration of war. It was, however, deleted at Imperial General Headquarters' insistence. This meant that, regardless of the timing of this note, it meant that Japan's last note failed to give notification of the commencement of hostilities, and it served merely as notice of Japan's intention to end or sever the Japanese-US negotiations. But there was, or what remained was the question of the timing of the delivery of this note. Tojo himself took no issue with Imperial General Headquarters' insistence on the importance of the element of surprise. He had spoken with colleagues of his belief that the armed services ought to move at midnight on December 8, again Japan time, and that a declaration of war could follow sometime thereafter. He sought and received assurances from Director General of the Cabinet Legislation Bureau, Moriyama Eiichi, that because combat was the prerogative of the Supreme Command, and because declarations of war were the responsibility of the Cabinet, there were, and I quote, no constitutional issues, end quote, if operations preceded a declaration of war. This meant Tojo could, as per his emperor's instructions, remain within the framework of the Constitution, and at the same time he could ensure that that Imperial General Headquarters got what it wanted, namely operational surprise and hopefully, therefore, operational success at Pearl Harbor. Now, the emperor was removed from all of these conversations. In only one instant on the eve of war did he come close to realizing that his government had decided against diplomatic notification of the commencement of hostilities. And I'd like just for a brief moment to consider that moment. The emperor, in conversation with Tojo, cited the precedent set by the imperial rescripts issued at the outset of the Sino-Japanese, Russo-Japanese Wars, and he specified his desire, the emperor specified his desire that the imperial rescript specify Japan's commitment to its international legal obligations. Tojo took issue with this request. He told his emperor it might be necessary in the war's opening phase to land troops in Thailand. He added his hope that his cabinet's ongoing diplomatic efforts might convince the doggedly neutral Thais to accept these troop landings, but in the event the Thais rejected Japan's diplomatic overtures, it would be necessary to violate Thai neutrality and land troops in Singora in southern Thailand. Such action would be in direct contravention of Japan's international legal obligations. And on these grounds, Tojo told his emperor that mention of Japan's international legal obligations, that it was a bad idea to include this in the imperial rescript declaring war. Now, troop landings which violated Thai neutrality were, maybe this is not a minor issue, but it's a comparatively minor infraction if we compare it to perhaps what Tojo could have said, or what Tojo might have said in this meeting with the emperor. But he didn't say anything more because his advice, the emperor assented to Tojo's advice, and on the grounds that it might be necessary to land troops in Thailand and thereby violate Thai neutrality, this was enough to secure the emperor's assent to no mention of international law in the imperial rescript. There was, of course, much else which Tojo could have said, but he deliberately and consciously left unstated. For one thing, Tojo maintained his complete silence on the war's opening shots and the armed services' prioritization of the element of surprise. He justified this silence by noting to himself that he had only learned of the Pearl Harbor and Malaya attack plans in his capacity as army minister, not in his capacity as prime minister. And this is such an integral issue. So maybe I'll just try and explain myself a little bit further on this point. So as army minister, Tojo was invited to meetings of Imperial General Headquarters precisely because he was an army general on active service. He was not receiving that invitation to join Imperial General Headquarters as Prime Minister. So he was, but just keep that in mind, because now when he's speaking to the Emperor about the wording of the Imperial Rescript, he's reporting to the Emperor in his prime ministerial capacity. In short, and however absurd it seems, Prime Minister Tojo did not know of the Pearl Harbor and Malaya attack plans, and he could not mention these while reporting to the Emperor as Prime Minister Tojo, reinforcing the belief that he did not need to explain to his Emperor the precedent-shattering decision to dispense with a two-step declaration of war was the above-mentioned advice Tojo had received from the competent authorities, including the nation's top diplomat and the government's leading legal voice. What then might we draw from this? The Emperor took on good faith Tojo's representations concerning Thai neutrality, troop landings in Thailand, and the need to refrain from mentioning international law in the Imperial Rescript. And we might ask ourselves, why should the Emperor not have taken these representations on good faith? Expecting the Emperor to realize that Tojo was in this case engaging in a series of half-truths and obfuscations is to overlook the natural presumption that the government would follow historical precedent and issue the Imperial Rescript after having already issued diplomatic notification of the end of the commencement of hostilities. Now, by way of conclusion, I'd like to point to various themes and issues which have emerged during the course of this talk. So you might recall that at the very beginning of the talk, I suggested that I would be examining this roughly 6-week period between Tojo's prime ministerial appointment and the opening shots of war in the Pacific. I think by considering that time period, we've seen not only, hopefully, we can see not only the processes by which Japan went to war in the Pacific, but we see various other themes and issues which I think are important, and two, I think they also receive quite a deal of attention during the course of my biography of Tojo. So just to point a few of those out very quickly. First is Tojo's very, very complex relationship with his emperor. Tojo was extraordinarily deferential to the emperor and always acted in, almost always acted in strictest accord with his emperor's instructions. And this much we've seen in Tojo's actions in the days and weeks after his prime ministerial appointment. But we've also seen another side to Tojo. He proved willing in those final days before war to mislead his emperor. Clearly, Tojo did not want the emperor to know of his cabinet's intention to launch hostilities without issuing a declaration of war, and he engaged in a series of half-truths in order to achieve this. The second theme I would point to is Tojo's, again, extremely complex relationship as both Prime Minister and as Army Minister with Imperial General Headquarters. The difficulties in coordinating cabinet policy and Imperial General Headquarters' concern for operations was difficult and problematic. And it was so difficult and so problematic that ultimately Tojo in February 1944 decided to short-circuit the endless arguments by himself assuming the post of Army Chief of Staff. Some in the army celebrated that move. Others, however, were concerned about the cherished independence of the Supreme Command. In other words, they felt that Tojo was, in fact, that he, precisely because he was trying to better coordinate the decision-making processes between the cabinet and Supreme Command, certainly some in the army felt that he was, in fact, stomping all over this cherished notion of the independence of the Supreme Command. But in February 44, Tojo stared down his opponents and took on that role. Another theme I would point to is Tojo's relationship with the Imperial Japanese Navy. As we have seen, he allowed the Navy its voice on the matter of forecasting the prospect of victory in war in the Pacific. But in an episode I've not touched on today, he had interfered in the process by which the Navy chose its cabinet-level representative, in other words, its Navy Minister, and Tojo had, in fact, secured a yes man as Navy Minister. In many ways, this made it easier for Tojo to ram things past the Navy than might otherwise have been the case. Certainly, it may have been much more difficult for Tojo to achieve his agenda had a more combative admiral represented the service on cabinet. But herein also lay the seed of Tojo's ultimate downfall, or his ultimate fall from political power, because by 1944, opposition to Tojo from within the Navy congealed around the conviction that the Navy Minister's ongoing servility to Tojo was a liability. On this basis, naval elders summoned all the service's political strength and made it possible for the emperor ultimately to end Tojo's time as Prime Minister. Now, I could probably say a whole bunch more, but I think I've probably already spoken a little too much. So I will leave things there and open the floor to questions.
Hi, Professor Mauch. How are you?
Well, thank you, Alex. How are you?
Good. What time is it and where are you?
I'm in Sydney. And it is currently about 20 to 2 a.m. So a little early or late, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah, I don't see a bottle of beer anywhere near you. Are you?
No, 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 no. I need to stay on my toes. Make sure I can answer any questions that come my way.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I've really enjoyed your book. It was a real eye opener for me. My favorite illustration, if you like, is the map of the Japanese Empire here. Um, and I think that we forget just how successful the Japanese were in the first couple of years of World War II, and actually, from your point of view, how close they came to Australia. Um, I mean, literally, it's a quick hop and a jump, isn't it, for the Japanese to invade Australia? Um,
Mhm.
we have a few questions, but I have to apologize that we only have about 15 minutes for you to answer um, a lot of questions, I hope.
Mhm.
Um, if you don't mind, I'm going to pepper you with a few broader questions because um, the context is really important here. How do we? Can you give us a very brief potted history of Japan in the 20th century and how we get to World War II and how we have uh, sociopathic monsters like Tojo determine the fate of an extraordinary country? How does he get to be, as I have written just here, the very definition of brutality, ignorance, deceit, and ultimately cowardice? I mean, he couldn't even succeed in killing himself at the end, which seems to me deserving of the enormous contempt of the Japanese people, because at the end you can at least kill yourself properly, as many so-called honorable Japanese leaders did. Tell us a little bit about Japan and how we get to Tojo and World War II.
Okay, so to do this as succinctly as
Quickly,
possible,
yeah.
I think maybe what we can say is that how should we do this? Okay, so maybe if we note that say with victory in the Russo-Japanese War back in 1904-05, that puts Japan in a very, very elite club along with the various other imperial powers, alongside the Brits, the Germans, the Americans, and so on. Uh, by the end of World War II, there were really, I mean, basically, it had the European powers had were, I guess the Brits were still there, but for all intents and purposes, the Pacific was very much a Japanese-American playground, almost as it were. And so in the beginning of the 1920s, in fact, and I'm sure many here will recognize this, the Japanese, the Americans, and the British participated in the so-called Washington system established at the Washington Conference of 1921-22. And that, in essence, that was buttressed by two key decisions. One was to limit the size of their navies, and the other was to refrain from interfering in Chinese domestic politics. And if you put those two things together, what it essentially meant was that the world's three biggest navies were essentially cooperating with each other in pursuit of essentially commercial competition in China. And this proved a remarkably stable system that actually served all three powers' interests. Then hits the Great Depression. And the Great Depression or the Washington system unravels with the Washington system, and within the Japanese army in particular, there's a notion that whatever had happened during the 1920s under this so-called Washington system had been like a fool's dream, and the army says we've got a different idea, we've got a different approach, and that different approach was basically conquest and cutting off large chunks of China. In the first case, say in Manchuria. To put Tojo's rise into this context, so the first thing to note, of course, is that Tojo was himself a professional military officer, and that means that excuse me, he's within the, if you want to call it the bureaucracy, the single most powerful institution in the Japanese state. It's certainly not the only institution, but it's the single most powerful. And his mastery of detail, of policy, his again, his incredibly formidable character means that through the 1930s, and ultimately by, say, the very early 1940s, he rises to the top of the army. And he then is able to harness the army's institutional power so that actually all of that institutional power is channeled through his person, which gives him just this immense degree of, quite literally, nobody in Tokyo could tackle him. Certainly not until, say, mid-1944, when repeated losses in the Pacific have completely undermined his position.
Um, did he know that awakening the sleeping giant would lead to ultimate defeat in World War II? I mean, was he fooling himself as much as he was the emperor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the first point to note is that here again, he deferred to the Navy because again, this is the Navy's responsibility. He was aware of those dissonant voices from within the Navy, which argued that there was no way that the Navy could, in fact, defeat the US Navy in the Pacific. He was well aware of those voices and had, in fact, met with any number of admirals who had told him as such or as much. He he himself, at the very least, he recognized that war against the United States would push Japan to its outermost limits. And I'm quite certain he never used the terms himself, but I mean, I think we really should be. He was not stupid. He was a very intelligent individual. He could see that at the very, very least, this was going to be incredibly difficult, and to some extent, it was quite a gamble. I think he could see that. Yeah, but again, I would really stress that point that so far as he's concerned, that responsibility for forecasting victory in the Pacific, that's almost 100% a naval responsibility.
Uh, what causes the dominance of Japanese militarism in the 1930s in Japan? Because if you look at the 20th century, if you look at this, I mean, I've been to Japan, I've been to Hiroshima, and I'm always struck by this beautiful tension between ancient tradition and spirituality and incredible modernism. So, can you tell us about why men like Tojo, why the Japanese military was able to dominate this extraordinary society that had enjoyed this burst of modernism and creativity and industrialization? How did they get to be so dominant?
Okay, so the army's institutional power, maybe we can, if we just go back a little in time and go back
Yep.
to the very beginnings of the moment or the years immediately. So Japan in 1868 dispensed with its old feudal form of government where you have the samurai and so on, and instead pushed out into the modern world. And of course, it did so at the point of a gun. The Western powers were circling it. And so, in any event, this new imperial Japanese government, within 10 or so years of its founding, faced a very, 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 very serious challenge from disgruntled samurai, led by one of the government's own former leaders, a figure, Saigo Takamori, who is fictionally at least represented in the Tom Cruise film, the Last Samurai, I think it is. Uh, he led some 10,000 samurai in revolt against this new imperial government. That's in 1877. And ultimately, it took every last ounce that this new imperial army could throw at these samurai to put them down. And so this, in essence, this embeds the army as the backbone of the state. I mean, no army equals the end of this new imperial state, quite literally. And so this embeds it as that very backbone of the state. And certainly among among Japanese military officers, there was a very, very deep sense of the institution, not only of the institution as that backbone of the state, but as very much of themselves, say, as the emperor's vassals, and that they were carrying out the emperor's will, even though on so many occasions they're actually whatever they're doing is in direct contradiction to whatever the emperor may have wanted at any given point in time.
Um, Thank you for that. We have a statement here by Jeffrey Foss. It seems the Japanese leadership let the Japanese people down. War with the US was not a good decision, and you don't need to be a military genius to realize that. Can you comment on that?
Yes, so that first point that the leadership let the Japanese people down, very much so. This was very much the if we tap into say Japanese public consciousness at the end of World War II, uh, practically everybody in Japan was pointing the finger of blame directly at Tojo. He came, uh, or maybe if we zoom out from Tojo himself, almost everybody in Japan blamed the army, and in particular, that finger of blame was pointed at Tojo, partly because he came to more or less personify the army, but also, as you noted earlier, because he failed in his suicide attempt. And so put those two things together, and Tojo became, within Japan itself, was public enemy number one. And I would suggest that although, of course, with the passage of time, perhaps those passions have subsided somewhat, he remains, so far as contemporary Japan is concerned, he remains the face of World War II and is therefore reviled as, again, to maybe not, or at least to paraphrase the questioner there, he's the guy who let the Japanese down and in fact led them to national ruination in World War II.
Um, we have a question here. Do you see a particular tipping point in Tojo's consolidation of power? Was Tojo's decision to relieve Army Chief of Staff, I can't pronounce this, but
Mhm.
I can spell it,
Yeah, Sugiura.
Sugyama, blah, 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 after the
Mhm.
attack on Truk in February 1944 and Tojo's usurpation of this title? Is that a critical moment? Is that a critical moment for you, that this one that
So
out here?
yeah, so in February 1944, Tojo remained as prime minister. He remained as army minister. He'd in fact taken on a couple of other ministerial portfolios at that time, and he also took on the role as army chief of staff. And so what he did there was, arguably, I mean, he's actually there. And certainly the emperor was worried about, as were many of his professional military colleagues. They were worried that actually what he's doing here is that cherished notion of the independence of the supreme command of the army general staff, its independence from cabinet. Now that Tojo is all of these various ministerial roles as well as army chief of staff, suddenly now that separation of powers, as it were, has been completely nixed and combined in a single individual. So I'm not sure if this exactly answers the question, but right there is a very serious moment because he's now taking charge of a whole new a portfolio, as it were, with a massive degree of responsibility. Maybe we might, I'll just, to round off this answer, what it effective from his viewpoint, it meant that maybe he could actually direct Japan's war efforts better than he had been able to hitherto. The flip side of the coin was that now it became a whole lot easier to pin blame directly on him from within. So from those oppositional voices within Japan's ruling circles, particularly from within the Navy, it gave them some. It gave them something that they could actually pin on him.
Uh, do you have any criticisms of US policy towards Japan in the late 1930s? I mean, the eventual oil embargo, was that not inevitably going to lead to some kind of war?
Yeah, well, yes. So the embargo. So the Roosevelt administration embargoed or placed or a complete embargo on trade with the Japanese, and of course at the same time froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Let's say late July, maybe early August 1941, and at that point, well, from that point on, in particular, if we kind of zero in on, well, certainly Tojo was doing it, but equally, so too was most particularly the Navy Chief of Staff. He's essentially looking at. I'm not sure if anybody can see me on the camera here, but they're essentially looking at Japan's oil stocks and they're seeing them dwindle day by day, and that there's no way of replenishing those oil stocks unless Japan does one of two things. Either it must, at this point, effectively, and I'll put the word in kind of scare quotation marks, Japan would have to surrender to US demands and thereby regain access to oil, or it would have to go into what today we call Indonesia, down into Borneo and places like where the oil wells down there. Those oil wells down in the Dutch East Indies, going down into there necessarily meant war against, essentially against the United States and Britain. So it placed Japan in a situation where its choices were, well, there's any number of comments from admirals following surrender. They said that they felt as though they had been painted into a corner. I would suggest that perhaps they painted themselves into a corner because, of course, the Roosevelt administration only embargoed trade with Japan in response to a Japanese advance into the southern portion of French Indochina. In other words, more Japanese, maybe not aggression, but certainly a Japanese expansion. So I'm not sure if that's exactly a criticism of the Roosevelt administration, but it certainly took a hard line toward the Japanese in 1941, that's for sure.
Would a different kind of diplomacy have avoided World War II in the Pacific?
From the
America,
US?
from the US?
I guess it could have, but I think that would be to ignore some of the foundation stones of US policy. So, for example, Roosevelt was highly conscious, as I think we all know, was highly conscious of the need to keep the Soviets in the fight. No Soviets mean that the Nazis, it's going to be impossible to knock the Nazis out. So he's highly conscious of that need, and whatever Japan was doing had a very, very, very big impact on the Soviets' chances of survival in World War II. So I think that needs to be borne in mind. So whatever Roosevelt or the Roosevelt administration taken a more conciliatory stance toward Japan, what did that mean for wider American policy? And in that same framework, we might, if I zoom ahead to the dying days of Japanese-US diplomacy in 41. So the Japanese I won't remember the precise date, but in mid-December, proposed what they called a modus vivendi. Essentially, the Japanese said, what about we move out of southern Indochina and the Americans reopen, at least give us access to oil, essentially. So what they were suggesting was a return to the situation before that trade embargo. Actually, Roosevelt himself sat down and penned a counter proposal. Ultimately, it didn't go much farther than his own desk, but and certainly he's not the only figure in Washington doing this. So there was within the Roosevelt administration, there was certainly the sense that, oh, maybe this is an opportunity. And yet, ultimately, as best I can tell, the Roosevelt administration did not pursue did not offer a counter proposal and did not pursue diplomacy at this point, precisely because they were worried that, okay, if we do this again, say late-ish November 1941, what does this do for British morale? What does it do for Soviet morale? What does it do for Chinese morale? And again, what does that do for America's American policy, not just toward Japan, but in a global sense?
Well, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. There's time. I think there are a few seconds left for one last question. I want to thank you so much, Peter, for joining us so late.
Thank you very much for having it. Yes, this has been. I actually feel. I think I may have talked a little too long in my presentation. So I do apologize to everyone if I should have tried to contain myself to allow a bit more time for questions. So I do apologize.
You're doing very important work because so few of us know, but me included, know so little about the enemy, so to speak. One last question, because our next presenter is going to be talking about this in more detail. You must have been asked this many, many times before, but I'm hoping that you, as an Australian and someone who's really studied this period in beautiful detail, did we need to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Yeah, that's
been asked that many times.
A great question. It's a difficult question. I think here I am drawing very consciously on the work of my my advisor, if I think back to my grad level days, my grad student days, my advisor back then was Asada Sadao, who Yale trained historian, the great Japanese Navy's greatest historian. He published a prize-winning essay. This is back in the late 1990s, and frankly, much has been written in the meantime, in the subsequent 30 odd years, and yet a lot of what Asada said in that essay, for mine, is compelling. And so I'll do my level best to summarize his arguments. So he argued that, well, he made the very clear case that the Japanese government in 1945 was nowhere near, if we go before the atomic attacks, the Japanese government was in nowhere near surrender. The Japanese decision-making process required complete consensus, so that all of the ministers in the room, the chiefs of staff, had to agree. And so if there was only one dissenting voice, there could be no decision. So if you're discussing surrender, and in the Japanese context, in let's say August 1945, there were some very, very loud voices arguing against surrender. Principally, I won't name them, but the army minister, the army chief of staff, and the navy chief of staff were arguing vociferously for a continuation of the war. And so long as they held that position, the Japanese government, it was paralyzed. So you've got various others arrayed against them saying, whoa, we need to surrender. And these guys are saying, no, we don't. And it's paralyzed. It's gridlocked, and there can be no movement. And so Asada argued ultimately that it was the shock of the atomic bombs that actually compelled Japanese decision makers to surrender. Of course, there are others who argue that the atomic attacks were less necessary than Soviet entry into the war. I personally, I'm in agreement with Asada on this point. He pointed out that these are twin shocks. So in other words, he's not suggesting that the Soviet entry into the war, he's not saying that it was not a shock. But there's from the moment the Germans looked like their war was over, the Japanese army officers began saying to themselves, you know what's coming next, right? They could see the writing was on the wall. The Soviets, once the Germans were out, the Soviets were going to come after the Japanese in Asia and the Pacific. So if you compare that to an atomic attack, it's far less of a surprise, or a shock, shall we say. So that brings us back to this idea that it's the shock of the atomic bombs that actually compelled the Japanese government to surrender. And just as a final thought, I'll note that even after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, there are figures within the Japanese army in particular, including Tojo, at this stage retired, but nonetheless, Tojo, and in fact, he had an audience with the emperor where he counseled very, very strongly against a surrender and argued vociferously for a continuation of the war. This is after the atomic attacks. So even then, it's a close run thing. There's powerful voices arguing very hard against surrender.
Well, Peter, that's why we need historians like you to be able to sensibly answer questions that are very important that other people don't answer quite so well. I want to thank you very much on behalf of Friends for your time. Wonderful book. I wish you the best with it. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everyone.
I hope you continue to beat England in the Ashes for a long, long time.